Brexit has been a divisive topic for years, and over 8 years after the referendum and 4.5 years since we half-heartedly left, how do people feel about it? Yesterday I had the opportunity to speak to a group of people from wide and varied backgrounds, and I asked each one of them how they felt about Brexit, how they felt about us being part of the EU or not being part of the EU, how it has affected them, did they support leaving beforehand or not, and so on and so forth. And I was surprised by some of the answers. When I spoke to a couple of businessmen, they were very, very unhappy about Brexit. One of them said that in an industry that is intensive with human resources, like having a team of plumbers, builders, etc., leaving the EU has been catastrophic. In the words of one gentleman, if you know what you're doing and you have access to limitless labour, you can go from startup to 50 or 100 strong team within a year. And he said, in my case, it's been the reverse, because I am struggling for personnel after Brexit. I had over 100 people working for me, and I'm now down to 15 and struggling. And every time somebody leaves, I can't replace them, so I can see my business folding in the near future. This was replicated by a couple of other people who are in business. Personally, I can understand that, because despite the fact that I supported leaving the EU more on principle than anything else, for whatever reason, I always believed in this country's sovereignty, in this country's right to charter its own course, and I found our country being dictated to by a foreign entity to not sit well with me, and I never agreed with it. However, from a business point of view, leaving the EU has made life harder for me, especially where property is concerned. The UK has so many empty properties, so many properties in need of renovation, and the sheer lack of skilled people who will work for a reasonable fee means that many of these properties are now uneconomical to renovate, because the margin is smaller than the cost of renovating the property. But here's where it gets really interesting, because I spoke to several tradesmen who had come from countries like Bulgaria and Romania and Poland, and they were all against any form of being dragged back into the EU by the back door on freedom of movement. That surprised me, because they have changed their mind. They supported it, supported their entry into the EU. Obviously, it benefited them because they came to the UK and now have a better life. But when they were speaking brutally honestly, which I do respect them for, they almost said the same thing, that tradesmen now often earn amounts of £250 to £300 per day and upwards. And in their words, if there is freedom of movement, the daily price is going to go down, because there's going to be people working for £80 or £90 a day, and our business will go down. That's what they had to say about it. So it's really interesting. Also, my concern with regards to wanting to leave the EU and being against the freedom of movement wasn't anything to do with the people of Europe, of course. It was the numbers, and it was that with limitless numbers being able to come to this country, it was and always will be the poorest 20 or 30% who will suffer the most, because all of the jobs that are at or not far above minimum wage will slip back to minimum wage when there is an abundance of people prepared to work at minimum wage. If you look at the average building site and look at the earnings of the average labourer, for example, they're 15 or 16 pounds an hour, I understand. Same for dumper truck forklift drivers. The skilled people earn much more, but there are many industries that have pulled away from the national minimum wage, but not far above it. Have no doubt that if there were freedom of movement, those salaries would fall back to national minimum pay. And where young people who do seem to be in the, or rather the majority of them, do seem to be supporters of being part of the EU and would support rejoining, would support freedom of movement, they are the ones who are most effective. And ironically, they are the ones who I had considered the most in my support for leaving, because I feel it's fundamentally unfair that young people struggle to buy a house, that they can't afford their rent, etc. And freedom of movement invariably, by any metric, I don't care how it is put across, will result in greater demand for housing. Rents will rise, and simultaneously it pushes salaries down, which means that for young people who for the main part are in the bottom 20% of the scale of earnings, that makes a colossal difference. And yet they are the ones who are most in favour of freedom of movement and rejoining, or rather that, you know, they are unhappy that we've left. So it's a very, very complex situation. But what I am going to do, hopefully, is get to speak to some of the tradesmen out on building sites, hopefully over the next few weeks if I get the opportunity and I'm permitted, because I'd like to hear directly from people who work on building sites exactly how they feel, why they feel that way, because there's absolutely nothing wrong with supporting something because it benefits us personally. We vote because we vote what's going to make me better off, for many people. But even so, I still found it quite surprising that those who had benefited the most from freedom of movement and those who now have settled status in the UK literally, for the main part, want to now pull up the ladder. So where do we go from here? I don't know, but I do think that this is a debate worth pursuing, just to get a feel of what people really do want, and more importantly, why they want it. That's all for now. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, and I'll see you next time.